the DGMT Trust calls on politicians to commit to a common agenda for South Africa's children to ensure their well-being. They add that children are an underrepresented constituency, hardly spoken about in our current political discourse. Now, for more on this, I'm joined by Kentse, who's the Deputy CEO of the DGMT Trust. Kentse, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I guess before we get into what you're calling on politicians to commit to, let's talk a bit about the work that your trust does. A lot of building of society.
Good evening. Thanks so much for having me on this evening. I didn't hear the last part of your question, but I was able just to catch the first piece. DGMT is a public innovator that's committed to developing South Africa's potential. So exactly as you spoke to the people around the work that we've been involved in civil society, largely around commissioning projects, supporting the work of organizations that are delivering critical services in our community across the country, being engaged in convening and connecting like-minded individuals who are really keen on thinking about how do we place this country on a different trajectory. Our work cuts across education, working with children in early learning, working in schools, working in our communities, partnering with civil society organizations, issues relating to youth unemployment, as well as a broad set of other focus areas.
And actually the last part of my question, Kentse, you just answered, because it was talking about the work that you do when it comes to building civil society as well. Now, from this work that you've done, what are some of the concerns that you've noted that you might highlight the plight of children?
Sure. I think what's really critical and what we want to bring to the fore is the opportunity cost that's by not investing in children in South Africa. We know through numerous amounts of research that have been conducted in the space that the single biggest investment that a country can make is investing in the lives of our children, from education to healthcare to supporting their caregivers. And I think what we're seeing and the call to action that we're putting forward to our politicians is to say, we're actually not doing enough. We need to place our children at the center of our national agenda. We need to start thinking about, for us to think scalable interventions, scalable programs that can ensure that every child in South Africa is set up to meet the opportunities that they would be required to in order to achieve in their lives, whether that's being ready to read and count by the time they start school, being able to have a nutritious meal at home and grow up in a safe and loving environment. These are all critical building blocks for our children. And I think there are a couple of aspects where we're missing or gaps in how we've thought about that program or those issues. And I think that the call to action that we're making to our politicians is to say, let's do better.
Now, you know the old saying, children are to be seen and not heard. Do you find, Kentse, that these kinds of sayings and old adages as well translate to how we are dealing with the plight of children?
Absolutely. I think for us, what we see as being critical is that we're currently in an election moment, right? So everywhere you turn, you're driving down the street, you see all the election posters, you pick up the newspaper, you're chatting to your friends, your colleagues, whoever, we're talking about what's happening in our country. And there are a couple of key issues that have taken center stage. And I think these are critical, whether that's relating to youth unemployment, thinking about load shedding, thinking about, service delivery. These are all critical issues. But I think what we're saying is, in that public square, in those conversations, some of the aspects that are missing are the conversations around children. And I think a large part of that is because our politicians may not see children as a political constituency in the way that they may see young people or the way that they may see working people. And we really need to change that, because what happens is that when children are invisible in our political conversations, where they're not present, then we don't prioritize them in our budgeting. We don't prioritize them in our policy making. And that's why we're seeing some of the big challenges and gaps when it relates to children in South Africa. How many children are going to bed without adequate nutrition? How many children are not able to read by the time they get to grade 4? 81% of children in South Africa cannot read for meaning in grade 4. The number of children that are dropping out in our schooling system, these are all indicators that we need to do better. But we need to be able to do that by having a common conversation around what are the key pieces of work that we need to be doing to shift some of those trajectories.
You make mention that, it is an election year after all, and based off the current manifestos, would you say that enough is being said or spoken of in these manifestos as well? I know that a few of the political parties, if you read in between the lines as well, they do make big mention of it, like they do of load shedding and job creation and the economy. And of course, South Africa is dealing with a plethora of challenges, but children should be also right up top there as well. With the mention of early childhood development and the likes, things like that as well, do you think that's enough, what's being written and promised in these manifestos? Are we hearing enough of this rhetoric as well when they are going to campaign?
I think we had an opportunity to review some of the party positions that are reflected in the manifestos. And I think it is encouraging that we're seeing various parties raise critical issues around, the child support grant, around supporting caregivers, around issues related to nutrition and what we could be potentially doing to ensure that average South Africans can afford good, nutritious food. So that's encouraging. But exactly the word that you used, rhetoric. We need to go beyond that. I think what we're saying is we need to see this translate beyond just the words, beyond just what's written in text, to a real political agenda, real political will around some of the things that we need to shift. And I think what's the connection that I want to make to the work that we're driving at DGMT around this is around this piece of work around change ideas, where we're saying here's some real practical, evidence-based intervention we think could be transformational around issues relating to children. And a lot of these are based on work that we've been doing, but also work that others have been doing in South Africa and globally. And what we're seeing is that countries that prioritize children, countries that prioritize investments in the early years are able to reward 10, 20 years on. And these are not countries that are on a different trajectory to South Africa. These are middle-income countries that face very similar issues to the ones that we're facing in our education space relating to nutrition. So, for example, some of the ones that I'd like to highlight, looking at countries like Mexico and the Oportunidades program that they put in place around school enrollment and nutrition. There's others like Brazil and the Happy Child program, Chile's Child Grows With You program, where it was really centering how low-income households can access early learning programs and how we can support mothers during the first critical stages of their pregnancies. These are all critical building blocks, and there's evidence to illustrate what are some of the we can start pulling on. And what we're saying is it's great that that's in a manifesto. It's fantastic that our the significant importance of this work, but let's turn that into action. And our Change Ideas initiative is really around how do we do that?
When you make mention of some of these problems as well, when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to lack of scholar patrol, transport as well, that I can think of, where children are working for kilometers and also being at risk of crime, especially in the winter periods when they're leaving home much earlier to walk far off distances when you think of remote villages in some parts of the country as well. But also added to that as well, Kentse, there's this growing concern of child trafficking. Now, right now, it being an Easter weekend, a long weekend as well, there's a campaign at the Beitbridge border and other affected ports that are of concern. Now, that's been conducted by the Border Management Authority and the Department of Social Development. All hands on deck. Great initiative, but wouldn't it be fantastic to have it all year round?
No, absolutely. And I think those reports that we've seen coming out, and this isn't the first time this has been raised, are deeply concerning and deeply worrying, because our children being placed at risk and being some of the most vulnerable citizens in our country means that we have to do more to ensure their safety and their protection. Our children need to be growing up in loving and safe environments. And it doesn't matter where you are, you should be able to have that experience as a child. And I think what we're seeing through the work that's being done by DSD and others is recognizing that there are gaps in some of the safety mechanisms and protection that have been put in place to ensure that our children do not end up in these situations. And I think the thing that we've seen in our work is that it can't just be one department. It can't just be one state agency. When we're thinking about the journey of a child's life, it requires real collaboration and coordination between various government departments. And I think that's where the story connects here, is that the child who ends up in a context where they're not safe or they're not being looked after, that happens because there have been a couple of key failures along the way. whether it's in how we haven't supported the caregivers or intervened at the school level or safety and policing in our communities. And what they're saying is, if we can start seeing the bigger picture of why it's critical to have a national agenda that prioritizes children, we're going to keep having incidents like this. And I think it's great to have responses like we're having currently now during this period where we recognize that there's increased risk. But as you say, this is happening all the time in our country. Children in our country are exposed to high levels of violence, gender-based violence in the home impacting these children. So how do we put in place mechanisms that can protect our children? And I think what's great is there already are policies that recognize this. But again, it goes back to what I said earlier. It has to go beyond what's written in policy. It has to go beyond rhetoric. There has to be real action.
Now, you've put it quite succinctly, but your parting shots, I mean, for those politicians who are still on the campaign trail, there's still a couple of weeks left before the 29th of May general elections. What would your final message be to those politicians?
You know, it was so interesting after the State of the Nation address where President Ramaphosa spoke about the story of Tinzwalo. There were so many, conversations around how does this represent the real lives of children in South Africa? And I think the president, painted a really positive picture of what's possible when we support our children. Our children in the earlier stages of their lives, our children succeeding in school, supporting their caregivers through initiatives like the child support grants and thinking about safety and in the community and how that child moves through from birth up until, entering the labor market. And that's fantastic. But the reality, millions of children are not having that experience. For example, 1 in 5 people in South Africa don't have enough food to eat. That directly impacts children. We know that 30 children are dying from malnutrition-related causes each day. 1 in 5 children are stunted for their age in South Africa. So we have to do better. This isn't something that is a negotiable. And I think my parting shot is to say to politicians, when DGMT created the Change Ideas Initiative, it was to say, let this be a catalyst for engaging in conversations around what are the things that we can do to change the trajectory that we're currently on. Where are the real opportunities? And we're saying this isn't a conversation just for policymakers and politicians, but it's a conversation for those of us in our own communities, at church, at school, at work. Join us in this conversation, access the resources on our website and be a part of thinking differently about what we can do as South Africans to prioritize children.
Because we all really do need to play our parts. 30 children dying of malnutrition is 30 too many. Thank you so much for your time this evening and sharing your insights.